During the night of January the 20th, 1981, 52 American diplomats arrive in Algiers from Tehran. They can finally breathe freely after being held hostage in Iran for a very long and difficult time.
Feeling great right now. Best I've felt in 444 days.
Thank God we're home.
The hostage crisis lasted 444 days, each one an ordeal filled with psychological torture and physical abuse. For the world's most powerful nation, it was 444 days of humiliation that ended with it having to cede to the demands dictated by an Iran in the midst of its own revolutionary uprising. Several decades of resentment towards the United States spurred the events that took place from November 1979 to January 1981. Resentment that's still alive in Iran. The U.S. Embassy, focal point of the hostage crisis, and now a museum named U.S. Den of Espionage Museum, keeps hate towards America alive. The embassy was seized on the morning of November the 4th, 1979. The operation was prepared by Islamic leaders in the universities in Tehran, who incited 400 students to go storm the American embassy. Despite the revolutionary turbulence and anti-American sentiment in the country, the embassy did not increase security. The Marines, who were ordered not to shoot, didn't resist for very long. The American diplomats who'd been controlling Iran for decades underestimated the siege carried out by a group of 20-year-olds.
I thought that the adults in the room would act and realize this something like this is simply unacceptable. What happened was there were no adults in the room. Or even worse, the adults encouraged the children who were running amok.
I knew that we were in trouble when I heard 1 or 2 days after the embassy seizure that Khomeini had backed the students who had invaded our premises.
At the beginning of the hostage crisis, Iran had only recently come under the rule of an important religious dignitary, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who quickly donned the cloak of supreme leader of the nation. His followers called him Imam Khomeini. He came to power following the Iranian Revolution that overthrew the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah had ruled the country with an iron fist for nearly 40 years, backed by the United States for political and security support. Crowds flocked to see Khomeini at each of his appearances, but he knew his power was fragile. He had to walk a fine line to please the people on all political sides who had brought him to power. The Islamists who were devoted to him, the pro-West liberals who supported him, but who wanted to limit his role to that of a moral authority, the movements on the left which hoped to one day control the country. Khomeini decided to eliminate all political forces that stood in his way of securing absolute power. Clever strategist, he asked the Islamist forces to carry out anti-American actions to get the people on his side. He didn't want to leave anti-American sentiment, which was the driving force in Iran, in the hands of the left, which was becoming more and more powerful.
ما تنها تلاشی که کردیم
After the siege, our only goal was to let the political leaders of the country know that we were not part of the Marxist left movements. We're people, militants, who have experience with struggles, the revolution, and we clearly and completely support Imam Khomeini.
The resentment of Iranians toward the United States in particular was always there. What the revolution changed was now people were able to express this, something they had never done before. And all of these pent up, it was like a pot, the lid just blew off the pot.
The takeover of the embassy by his followers was the opportunity Khomeini had been hoping for so he could cement his power. He immediately backed the hostage takers and hailed their action as a second revolution, even bigger than the first, which had overthrown the Shah just a few months earlier. The massive rallying sparked by the takeover of the embassy positioned Khomeini as the only protector of the Iranian people, dispossessed for so long by the Americans. It was also a chance for him to get a bargaining chip, freeing the hostages in exchange for extraditing the Shah, who had been taken in by the United States. The former monarch had been in New York since late October, receiving treatment for cancer. Khomeini was worried. He feared the Americans would attempt a coup to restore the Shah to the throne.
I think there was no question that the Americans would return the Shah to Iran. We just weren't going to do that. He had collaborated with us over many years, had made many sacrifices, so we owed him a great deal.
President Carter, when he agreed to allow the Shah to come to the United States for medical treatment, he was reluctant, but he agreed. And he turned to his advisors and he said, "What are you going to advise me to do when our embassy is occupied and our people are taken hostage?"
As soon as Khomeini came to power, several embassies were hit with takeover attempts by revolutionary groups. On February the 14th, 1979, the American embassy itself was the target of an attack by Marxist militants. Khomeini militia quickly had them evacuated. This time, the Americans knew that the situation was different. Khomeini's own followers were occupying the embassy. Jimmy Carter, the American president, sensed that negotiations would be difficult. His national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, suggested there might be another option, a rescue mission that the military had been secretly evaluating. In Tehran, confusion reigned supreme in the streets and within governmental bodies. There was no government. A council of the Islamic Revolution, whose members were all named by Khomeini, was running the country. This body nominated Abul Hassan Banisadr as Minister of Foreign Affairs.
I went to see Mr. Khomeini, who told me, "We're going to keep the hostages for 3 or 4 days, long enough for America to realize it has committed crimes, and then we'll free them." So I agreed to become Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Two weeks after the takeover and the start of the hostage crisis, Khomeini sent a signal. He instructed his son, Ahmad Khomeini, to free a few hostages. His son decided to release 13 of them, just African Americans and women. Although Banisadr was officially in charge of the fate of the hostages, his hands were tied. Khomeini forbade him from having any direct contact with the Americans. He and his advisor, Ahmed Salamatian, appealed to the UN and requested a meeting of the Security Council. They hoped to obtain a fair and balanced decision, conviction of the United States for their interference under the reign of the Shah, and the release of the hostages.
I went to the United Nations with this mission to try to get the UN Security Council to meet to discuss the hostage situation. And the Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Bani Sadir, would also be there in person. And we would come to an agreement. I was convinced that it was possible, that it was doable.
When I had to go to the UN Security Council meeting to solve the problem, Mr. Khomeini issued a statement saying, "No one will attend the UN Security Council meeting on Iran's behalf." So I resigned as Minister of Foreign Affairs.
That morning, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I read the news about the Minister of Foreign Affairs not coming. Let me tell you that up until the time that I got on the plane and left, I hid from the UN diplomats because I was ashamed.
Powerless, the Americans watched the days in captivity rack up as they awaited news from their fellow citizens trapped in Khomeini's grasp. The Iranians watched as authorities played a game of musical chairs. In late November 1979, a new foreign affairs minister was named, Sadegh Gobzadeh, an ambitious man who thought his close relationship with Khomeini would afford him some leeway to resolve the hostage crisis. Well aware that it was forbidden to speak with the Americans, he asked two friends, Christian Bourguet, a French lawyer, and an Argentine businessman, to contact the American administration. From the outset, President Jimmy Carter gave the Iranians a promising sign. He asked the Shah to leave America and continue his treatment in Panama, a country under American control. On behalf of Iran, Christian Bourguet, the lawyer, wanted to begin the extradition process. The Panamanian president was playing both sides. He told the Iranians that legal action was possible, and he ensured that the Shah was safe.
In his dealings with Khomeini, Gobzadeh always presented Khomeini with a done deal. Gobzadeh wasn't one to discuss taking action with Khomeini. Gobzadeh took action first, and then he packaged it up.
The United Nations was still looking for a way to resolve this international crisis with unforeseeable consequences. In agreement with the American president, the UN Secretary General traveled to Tehran in early January 1980. Kurt Waldheim hoped to meet with both the American hostages to make sure they were in good health and Khomeini to negotiate their release. Instead, he was met with an angry mob. Hundreds of Iranians unleashed their hatred of the Shah on him, the same Shah who was accused of committing torture and crimes with the help of the Americans. Kurt Waldheim left Tehran without meeting with Khomeini or the hostages. He later recounted that he was scared for his life. The UN was not giving up. It still attempted to be the mediator. Waldheim accepted Sadegh Gobzadeh's proposal to create a commission to mitigate the explosive situation in Tehran. Inside the UN, talks about who should be on the commission went on for several weeks. It was finally formed in February and arrived in Tehran on an official mission to investigate criminal interference by the Americans in Iran during the reign of the Shah.
But we went further than that. We had the tacit agreement of everyone, even the Iranians themselves. The Commission was looking for a way to free the hostages, and step by step really wanted to meet with hostages.
We thought that a visit like that of the members of the UN Commission could be a way to gather information. that could later be used to harm the hostages and us students.
Mr. Khomeini made a statement saying that the UN Commission had to deliver its report before leaving Iran. The Commission came to see me, and they said, well, you know, following a statement like that, even though we want to issue a report, it would have zero validity.
The members of the commission refused to submit themselves to Khomeini's demand. They left Tehran without seeing the hostages or gaining the slightest glimmer of hope of freeing them. Their mission was a failure. It was now a glaring fact that the UN was powerless and could do nothing to resolve this international crisis. While the UN was attempting mediation, secret talks between the Americans and the Iranians never stopped. They were led by the French lawyer, Christian Bourquet. In mid-February, he set up a secret meeting in Paris with the Iranian Foreign Affairs Minister and President Carter's White House Chief of Staff. Hamilton Jordan arrived in the French capital under an alias and wearing a wig and moustache. As for Sadegh Gobzadeh, he was in France on official business. The two men met very discreetly for dinner at a hotel. Sadegh Gobzadeh began their one-to-one discussion by expressing his concern. If the communists in Iran find out about this meeting, I'll lose my job and possibly my head. He reassured Hamilton Jordan that the hostages were doing well and that he had a plan to get them released. He believed that the Iranian people's anger and the hostage-taking were due to the United States' domination over Iran for the past 30 years. The American replied that it was time to look forward to the future and stressed that President Carter was not an interventionist, despite pressure from numerous Americans who were calling for military action. Gobzadeh wanted new relations with the United States. Hamilton Jordan seized the opportunity to slide him a note about how Soviet troops were amassing along the Iranian borders and told him there was an imminent threat.
During this crisis, there was a major event that could have overshadowed the crisis itself, and that was the invasion of Afghanistan.
It was a question of whether this hostage-taking by the Iranians would lead to a major confrontation between the two superpowers. So, Mr. Jimmy Carter had more things to think about.
Soviet tanks had closed in on Iran. In late 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to come to the aid of an allied government threatened by an Islamist uprising, secretly backed by the Americans. In the midst of the Cold War, the White House feared a disaster scenario. The invasion of Tehran by the Soviets, who now had two routes to enter Iran, by the northern border and the eastern border. The CIA issued extremely alarming reports. They noted that Soviet troops had amassed at the Iranian borders and that the Iranian communists and the left had gained ground. The Americans wondered whether dealing with Khomeini wouldn't be better than watching a communist government take over Tehran.
Actually, one of our problems was that we had no insight into the workings of the Iranian government. We had no way of influencing their decisions. We were dealing very much alone against an unknown antagonist.
Let me tell you that the most important element of the United States of America's policy regarding Iran was a lack of visibility. They had no idea of how to analyze the political situation inside Iran. It was beyond their control.
The extradition of the Shah that the Iranians were hoping for didn't happen. On March the 24th, 1980, the Shah left Panama to seek refuge in Egypt. His friend Anwar Sadat was in charge. Christian Bourget was disappointed, but still hoped to negotiate a solution with the Americans. On the way to Tehran from Panama, the French lawyer stopped in Washington to meet with Hamilton Jordan, who had a surprise for him: a meeting with Jimmy Carter. Christian Bourget was impressed. He wanted to show the American president the positive aspects of the situation. He thought the Shah's leaving Panama might satisfy the Iranians. If he was fleeing justice, it was because he'd committed crimes. Regarding the ongoing hostage negotiations, he tried to reassure Carter and told him progress was being made. Jimmy Carter replied angrily, "I don't see the slightest indication of progress. We're exactly where we were 4 months ago. The hostages are suffering every day. Our patience is starting to look like weakness. Something needs to change."
We had no reliable contacts. The people who would talk to us had no authority. The people who had authority wouldn't talk to us.
What was particularly impressive was how the entire collection of resolution strategies that they envisaged failed.
Iranians had been holding American citizens in captivity for 155 days. The situation was unbearable for many Americans, who expressed their exasperation with protests. The American president couldn't turn a deaf ear to the anger rumbling across the country, especially given that he was running for re-election in the upcoming presidential election that would take place in just a few months. On April the 7th, Jimmy Carter finally decided to make some serious decisions. While traveling aboard his presidential plane, Air Force One, he wrote down the measures that he planned to announce to the American people, including a total embargo in Iran and the end of all diplomatic relations. He also decided to step up preparations for a military operation. Jimmy Carter asked Hamilton Jordan, his chief of staff, to once again meet with Sadegh Gobzadeh, the Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs, to find out what the Iranians might know about the rescue mission that was in the planning stages. A second top-secret meeting was set up again in Paris. The Iranian minister did not agree with Carter's decisions to implement an embargo and sever diplomatic relations. He then warned Hamilton Jordan, "I hope your president won't do anything reckless, like attacking my country." The American replied that no such thing would happen. Gobzadeh didn't know that this meeting was part of an American disinformation campaign to make the Iranians think that they still preferred negotiations. Gobzadeh did not reassure Jordan on the fate of the hostages. He thought they'd continue to remain in captivity for months before being able to go home because the situation in Iran was very tense. There was no longer any hesitation about the rescue mission. On April the 20th, the countdown to the military operation began. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the U.S. National Security Advisor, who'd recommended such action be taken at the beginning of the hostage crisis, saw his suggestion finally come to fruition. Operation Eagle Claw began off the coast of Iran during the night out over the Arabian Sea. To improve security, the Pentagon strategist had planned for the operation to last all weekend, which for the Iranians was Thursday, April the 24th, and Friday, April the 25th. 8 helicopters took off from the USS Nimitz, an aircraft carrier, and 6 C-130 Hercules jets took off from the American base on Masira Island. 120 men were aboard these aircraft, which flew at low altitude at night to a place dubbed Desert One in the Iranian desert, about 300 kilometers from Tehran. The operation also required helicopters that transported stormtroopers to a base closer to Tehran and trucks that took them to the occupied American embassy. The scenario didn't go as planned. Several accidents occurred while conducting the mission, including the fatal crash of a helicopter and a refueling jet at Desert One. Impossible to continue the operation. The order was given to abandon the mission. The Americans left behind 8 soldiers who perished in the fire.
President Carter tried a military operation, which was frankly very dangerous and very difficult. I don't know what would have been possible that would have kept all of us safe and got us out alive.
Not very many other people subscribed to that action because we had seen that the Iranians could be quite ruthless and would have no hesitancy in gunning down their enemies if they thought it served their interests.
The U.S. Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, who had always been opposed to any military action, resigned. A tough blow to Jimmy Carter, who lost an important member of his staff and a friend. Once the failed operation was no longer a secret, the American president asked all his advisors to let their Iranian contacts know that the United States had no intention of invading their country. His top concern was saving the lives of the hostages. The following day, he met with his military generals to debrief the mission. The meeting of April the 26th was an uncomfortable situation for President Carter. He was pushed to take military action by certain members of his staff, but he was forced to deal with its failure alone. He even got lectured by the military brass, who criticized his leadership. Disconcerted, Carter didn't discuss the criticism. No one wanted to dwell on the failure of the operation. The president steered the discussion to a new rescue mission. Once again, the discussions got out of hand. The craziest of options were brought up, including a large-scale invasion of Iran. Frustrated and weakened, the president ended the chaotic meeting. It was completely devoid of military introspection, and no decision was made on how to move forward.
No field analysis would have come with or given such a plan a probability rate of 1 in 1,000. A rescue operation in the heart of Tehran during a revolutionary uprising carried out by a few commandos and helicopters that would land in the desert a few hundred kilometers away?
At that point, there were hundreds, on average, 200 armed students at the embassy ready to defend the occupation at all costs. The embassy itself was very big. We didn't know where the hostages might be. They were absolutely not being held all together.
Khomeini's followers thought that the hand of God caused the operation to fail. Iran, which piously followed the principles of Islam, was protected. The Ayatollah Khalkhali, who carried out the regime's dirty work, had the charred bodies of the American soldiers put on display for the press. After this propaganda stunt, the bodies were handed over to the Swiss embassy, which represented American interests in Iran.
The Swiss embassy took possession of the bodies, which obviously had great significance for the Iranians. So it was a bit difficult to convince them that they nevertheless had to be taken away so they could be brought back to the United States.
Khomeini emerged strengthened by the failed military operation, but he still needed to share power. His former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bani Sadr, had been elected President of the Republic, winning a solid majority of 76% of votes. Although he was very popular, he struggled to exert his authority before Khomeini. He would have to wait a long time for the green light before forming his administration. He also had no power over the hostage-takers, who only obeyed Khomeini. President Bani Sadr would not even be informed of the transfer of the Americans to various cities in the country, nor did he know where they were being held.
One night they came and said, pack up your things, whatever you have. We're moving you. And we're moving you a distance, not just from one room to another, but it's going to be a long trip. So I ended up in Isfahan, in the city of Isfahan, about 7 hours south of Tehran.
We students sensed the hostages and ourselves might be in real danger. So we immediately decided to split up and move the hostages to different regions in Iran. We did this to prevent any military interventions and terrorist and guerrilla operations.
They split them up and moved them to places all across Iranian soil. And no one knew where they were. The CIA was unable to locate the hostages, well, most of the hostages, right up until the end of the crisis.
The failed American military operation was an unexpected opportunity for Khomeini, who didn't want to come out a loser in the legislative elections, as he had done in the presidential election. The firm stance he took with the White House enabled him to appear to be the only one capable of getting the American superpower to give in. In early May, his supporters easily carried the vote in the first Majlis elections, the parliament of the Islamic Republic. Bani Sadr's friends were now the minority, and the entire left was eliminated.
For at least the first 8 or 9 months, we were useful to create hysteria and to mobilize support for the most extreme hardline factions in Iranian politics.
As a politician during the revolution, the Ayatollah Khomeini exploited and used the hostage crisis as a means to eliminate all his adversaries and build a power base where only he and his personal cabinet controlled everything.
In mid-May 1980, the elections in Iran were over, but the hostages were still locked up and had been rotting away for 200 days. In the United States, the presidential campaign was in full swing. Jimmy Carter tried to put on a happy face during his speeches as he campaigned for re-election, but he had no control over what was going on. His Western allies supported him half-heartedly. None of them wanted a confrontation with the Iranians. His longtime ally came to his rescue. The German Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, wanted to help him find a way to negotiate. In agreement with Jimmy Carter, he reached out to the president of Algeria, Chadli Benjedid. During a meeting, he discreetly said, "It's up to you Algerians to help the world by preventing the conflict between Iran and the United States from getting worse."
The Germans, like the Swiss, not only informed us, but also asked that the United States really insisted that they agreed to Algerian mediation, because everyone saw that Algeria was, at that time, and in those circumstances, the country with the best chance of successfully freeing the hostages.
There are Muslims in Algeria. In the eyes of Imam Khomeini and Iranian revolutionary leaders, the Algerian war was held in high respect. No such trust existed with the Swiss, the Swedish, the UN, or the Germans, but with the Algerians, it did.
The Algerians were invited to help us out, and they refused. They said regularly when we approached them that it was not the right moment.
The diplomat with the best understanding of the Iranian situation was Algeria's ambassador in Tehran, Abdelkrim Heraib. He had long been in close privileged contact with Khomeini's entourage. He advised his Swiss counterpart, who had been representing American interests since the occupation of the embassy. If you want to successfully resolve the problems in Iran, forget about traditional diplomatic avenues. Algeria's ambassador knew that real negotiations wouldn't be possible until Khomeini had decided it was time. Khomeini was in no rush to negotiate. He wanted to throw his weight into the American presidential election and prevent Jimmy Carter from being re-elected. He had hated him with a passion since he had backed the Shah during the popular revolt. Like a puppet master manipulating his primary players, this time Khomeini called upon the newly elected parliamentary representatives to take charge of the hostage affair. He wanted to drag out this crisis because Parliament was already bogged down with clan wars and unending procedures.
In my own case, being a representative, they took 3 months to give me my credentials because I was accused of complicity with the United States. At that point, I can tell you that the pro-American Western vermin label was getting stuck on anyone and everyone in power that they wanted to eliminate. Imam Khomeini considered our action as ultimately an action carried out by the people. And so it was up to the representatives of the people to decide how to end this affair.
Freeing the hostages was still not on the agenda in Parliament. Talks about forming an administration would last several months. After unending face-offs between Khomeini supporters and those backing President Banisadr, a government administration was finally named in late August of 1980. And in its top position was Mohammad Ali Rajai, an opponent of Banisadr. The president was thus removed from all important affairs. Sadegh Gobzadeh, the man who'd been secretly negotiating with the Americans, was not a member of the new government. He had lost the support of his mentor, Khomeini. Following a long fall from grace, he would be accused of plotting a coup d'etat and executed. While Iranian authorities fought their battles amongst themselves for months on end, the American hostages were still being held in captivity in undisclosed locations.
The destiny of the presidency of the Republic, of Parliament, and of the future regime was taken hostage. The solution came when the President of the Republic had already been relegated to ceremonial flower boy.
Khomeini eliminated all the obstacles before him. The theocratic regime he now led was firmly in place. He had gained complete control of Parliament and the government. The threat of the Shah returning to power was finally laid to rest once and for all when Mohammad Reza Pahlavi died on July the 27th in a hospital in Cairo following his battle with cancer. Khomeini had exploited the hostage crisis as much as he possibly could, but he didn't want to release the hostages without getting something in return from the Americans. While Parliament was squabbling over the fate of the hostages, he authorized a member of his family, Sadegh Tabatabai, to contact the Americans and let them know he was finally ready to negotiate.
With intermediary help from German diplomacy, Sadegh Tabatabai succeeded in establishing indirect but nonetheless concrete contact between the Khomeini regime and the Americans. And they came to a conclusion. Mr. Khomeini must make certain statements so that the Americans can be sure that Sadegh Tabatabai is truly representing Khomeini's wishes.
In the middle of a message to pilgrims starting their pilgrimage to Mecca in a newspaper on September the 13th, 1980, Khomeini slips in the demands he wants to impose on the White House. Return the Shah's assets to Iran, lift the sanctions on Iran, guarantee no political or military interventions, and lastly, unfreeze Iranian assets held by the United States. Jimmy Carter finally knows he can negotiate on the basis of these four demands. He sends his Deputy Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, to Germany to meet with the Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt. The Germans set up 2 meetings for the American with Khomeini's emissary, Sadegh Tabatabai, on the 16th and 18th of September, outside of Bonn. The initial discussions seemed promising. But the two men wouldn't meet again. On September the 22nd, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invades Iran. The war put an end to all contact between the White House and Khomeini's entourage. The Iranians weren't gullible. They knew the Iraqi dictator had received the green light from the United States to start a bloody war. The Iraqis wanted to annex territories, and the Americans hoped it would result in a weakened Khomeini-run Iran.
It was immediately seen as a way to quickly resolve the crisis with a simple postulate. Under attack from the exterior, the Iranians would have to abandon the conflict with the Americans, from which they'd already exploited all possible beneficial aspects.
In the United States, November the 4th, 1980, marked 1 year to the day that the hostages had been held captive in Iran. But this anniversary was overshadowed by another event. The Republican Ronald Reagan had been elected president, and that was the top story on news stations all across America. In less than 3 months, he'd take over in the White House, ending the Democrat Carter's presidency. While Khomeini was pleased with Carter's defeat, Reagan's election was not without danger for him. During his election campaign, Reagan had mentioned military action against Iran. The master timekeeper knew he had little time left to settle the hostage affair. Algeria was finally called in to lead the negotiations with the Americans.
The Islamic Republic had no alternative. The Iranian authorities knew that Reagan wasn't like Carter. Republicans weren't like Democrats. They knew that Reagan wouldn't take a seat at the negotiation table.
Therefore, they were afraid that once he was in office, he would launch an attack on Iran.
Day after day, the eyes of the American people were fixated on the number of days their fellow citizens had been held in captivity. On day 372, finally, a glimmer of hope that they'd soon be released reappeared. In early November 1980, the long-awaited negotiations got underway in Algiers. The Algerians took on the role of intermediary in what would become a long marathon of talks and bargaining, of compromises and coercion. In the Algerian capital, Warren Christopher and his advisors settle in, ready to try to hammer out an agreement, and intent on staying there until Jimmy Carter's last day in office. The Algerian negotiators, led by Mohammed Ben Yahia, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, quickly established a method of working. They would have 2 sets of discussions, one for discussions related to the political agreement, and one for the more complex discussions related to the assets belonging to the Shah and Iran that Iran wanted back. Since the Iranians still wouldn't speak directly with the Americans, the Algerian diplomats traveled back and forth between Algiers and Tehran to inform each side of the other's position.
The Algerian negotiators would come to Iran, listen to our demands, and negotiate with us. They would also explain the demands of the Americans and convey our suggestions and proposals to Algiers. And there they would negotiate with Warren Christopher and the American team based in Algiers.
Algeria wasn't just a simple mailman whose job was to deliver Iran's position to the United States and vice versa. It was an active player that would invent solutions of its own for both parties, who would either accept them or discuss them, and so on.
I think the first sign that something positive was happening was around Christmas time of 1980, when we were visited by 2 or 3 Algerian diplomats. So I told myself, this is serious now. something is going on.
The fate of the hostages was hanging in the balance simultaneously in Algiers, Tehran, and Washington. The Algerian capital had become the hub through which both parties' proposals and counter-proposals transited. Both the Iranians and the Americans wanted to move quickly. The political agreement was quickly reached. The United States promised in writing to respect a policy of non-intervention in the Islamic Republic. The US also guaranteed that no hostage would seek compensation from Iran for the long months of captivity. Negotiating the financial agreement, however, didn't go as smoothly. President Carter signed a decree that froze the Shah's assets, but he couldn't guarantee that funds held by private banks would be sent back to Iran. The Iranian negotiators used coercion to show their people that they were standing up to the American adversary.
هیچ مسئله‌ای گروگان‌ها برای ما نیستن، چه موندنشون چه رفتنشون. اگه آمریکا خواست شرایط مجلس شورای اسلامی ایران رو اجرا کنه، گروگان‌ها رو برمی‌داره میبره. اگر نخواست بازم برای ما مسئله نیست.
Despite this threat, the Iranian negotiators knew that Khomeini wanted an agreement to be reached, whatever the cost. On January the 14th, 6 days before Carter's term in office ended, along with the negotiations, Iran finally agreed to eventually take legal action in the courts to attempt to get back the Shah's assets. The two parties themselves would have to rely on an international tribunal to settle their numerous trade-related grievances. The Iranians and the Americans still couldn't agree on how Iran's assets and debts should be evaluated.
Clearly, Algeria had rather privileged relations with Iran, but it was a good opportunity to take advantage of that, to get Iran to give in.
It's quite possible that the Algerians wanted the crisis to end without their further involvement in it, and they supported what they considered to be a balanced approach to the negotiations.
The Algerian government fully executed its role as mediator and never pressured the Iranian government. If there was any pressure, it was inside the country. I remember during the negotiations, I'd get 2 or 3 phone calls a week from Ahmad Khomeini, Imam Khomeini's son, asking me on behalf of his father how the negotiations were progressing. He was very worried.
Jimmy Carter and his team were also worried. They saw the hours ticking by, and they still hadn't reached a financial agreement. From Algiers, Warren Christopher kept the president abreast of every little bit of progress being made in this last negotiation. The American administration contested the sums Iran was demanding. Before the fall of the Shah, the two countries had signed numerous civil and military contracts together. Some of them were paid up front, before they were even fulfilled. The Iranians wanted their money back. The Americans started calculating how much debt Iran had racked up, which explained the financial imbroglio driving the American president and his team. Carter was exhausted. He hadn't slept in several days. He was following the negotiations minute by minute, despite the time differences between Tehran, Algiers, and Washington. In Tehran, yet another crisis at the highest level of Iranian authority caused confusion. Although President Banisadr had been removed from the negotiation process by Khomeini, he attempted to thwart an agreement. He disagreed with the concessions made to the Americans. Algeria proposed freezing funds for future arbitration. On January the 19th, the day before Carter's term in office came to an end, the Iranians finally agreed with the amount of nearly $8 billion, which had to be deposited into an account managed by Algeria at the Bank of England to cover arbitration at a later date.
Harold, the money is in the bank, and the president's getting on now.
Hi, Bill. Hi, Bill. What's hold up? Why the hell not? It's getting dark. Yeah, in Algiers, I talked to Chris about a half hour ago, and he said that they were checking off each portion of money as it came in and comparing it with the list. But then he told me then that in 15 minutes they should have the certification. So it's 15 minutes late.
On January the 20th, at about 7:30 in the morning, Washington time, London and then Algiers certified the total amount deposited by the American banks. The Algerian negotiators immediately informed the Iranians.
We hear that the hostages are in the air.
Tehran also had to sign off on the agreement to freeze the amount of nearly $8 billion. President Carter's nightmare was still not over. The Iranians were taking their time to sign. Having failed to secure the release of the hostages during his presidency, he attended the inauguration of his successor.
Of the United States. So help you God. So help me God.
At 12:05 p.m., Washington time, Nabavi signed the agreement. Why? Because at that precise moment, they were on neutral ground between an outgoing president they hated and wanted to slap one last time and an incoming president they didn't want to have to deal with.
When at last the 52 Americans were about to be released, one last ordeal awaited them at the airport in Tehran before they could board the Air Algeria plane that had been parked on the runway for over 24 hours.
I heard noise, screams, insults that I could barely understand in Farsi, aimed at the people being brought to the plane.
I wasn't afraid so much as I was just sad. The actions of this group were so clumsy and so inept.
They entered the plane, clearly in shock, clearly disoriented. At the same time, they understood they were finally free.
Being on that plane, unless something unexpected was going to happen, we were out of there. What a change that was. Remember, of the 14 months that I was in captivity in Tehran, nine of those months, I was in solitary confinement.
I once again explained who I was to those who didn't know me, because the Swiss diplomats were asked to acknowledge the delivery of merchandise whose, let's not say contents, but rather whose identity was unknown. So I got the idea to ask the flight attendant for a piece of paper, and I wrote down the numbers from 1 to 52, because the agreement was to release 52 hostages.
52 former hostages who had to write down their names on a makeshift list. The Swiss diplomat methodically made his way through the plane, going from row to row to get the name of each freed hostage. He had to make a list that would be sent to the White House as proof that all the Americans had been freed. When Flavio Moroni got to the back of the plane, he realized there was a problem. Line 52 was empty.
I'm missing one person. What do we do? I wasn't ready to ignore the issue. Finally, looking at the list, I noticed a hostage had signed below line 40 instead of on line 41. That hostage became 40 bis, and the plane was able to take off.
The plane carrying the 52 Americans left the runway at Tehran Airport about 30 minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in. Destination, Algiers. During the flight, the former hostages were both joyful and tense. Only when the flight crew announced that they'd left Iranian airspace were they truly overjoyed. When they arrived in Algiers, the Americans willingly took part in an official welcome ceremony that Mohammed Ben Yahya, the Algerian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Warren Christopher, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, had organized. They then flew to Germany for medical examinations, and then finally on to the United States. In New York, a huge crowd cheered them on like heroes. They went up Broadway with their families, forgetting for a moment their ordeal in Iran. Some of them would live from now on with scars from the psychological torture they'd endured. Others would try as best as possible to move on from those 444 days that made a mark on their life and their country. The United States has not forgotten the humiliation they were subjected to. A lasting trauma settled in with the Americans, who realized their country was vulnerable. As for the Iranians, they continue to suffer from the cult of the power struggle with America that the current regime insistently glorifies to justify its existence. This late 20th century crisis marked the beginning of a shake-up in the political balance of power in the Middle East.